Don't know me, my name is Will Tanner, and I am the director of Onward, a think tank focused on levelling up economic opportunity and strengthening our social fabric, especially in the places where those things are weakest. And I'm delighted to welcome you today to this panel event, Social Contract, the relationship between business and society after the crisis, that's generously supported by EY. The last 18 months, I think it's fair to say, has fundamentally challenged some of the assumptions that we had about our understanding of the relationship between business and society. On the one hand, countless businesses have gone to extraordinary lengths to support the national effort against coronavirus. Last year saw banks extend unprecedented sums in commercial and consumer loans, firms reorientate their operations entirely to provide things like ventilators and hand sanitizer and other forms of PPE. And of course, pharmaceutical companies have in the last 12 months demonstrated their enormous social value by defying expectations to develop a working vaccine within a matter of months. But on the other hand, many companies have at the same time been criticised for issuing dividends, for claiming reliefs during the crisis, and the business world has been rocked by a series of corporate governance scandals that have coincided with the pandemic. And all of this has fueled some growing calls to use the opportunity presented by coronavirus and the pandemic to build back better and to build specifically a more equitable, sustainable and accountable model of capitalism. This comes after a decade in which the boundary between profit and purpose has blurred somewhat. Centuries of the UK being a leading centre of company law and standards of corporate governance have developed into a big debate about the future of corporate governance, and particularly the relationship between those businesses and a variety of different stakeholders within society. And we've had the 2018 Kingman Review, and we have now a Bayes consultation into corporate governance and audit as examples of this wider pressure and a kind of changing relationship potentially between business and society. So today we want to get into some of those big questions, and we want to ask some questions of a number of leading voices in this debate. So in particular, we're keen to discuss the extent to which the pandemic has reframed that relationship between business and society, and if so, how should that be reflected in changing models of corporate governance? How should we define good corporate behavior? What does that look like? And what should happen to companies, commercial entities that don't live up to that standard? And finally, what's the role of auditors post-pandemic, particularly given the very high levels of debt that have been taken on by private companies over the last year? And how can auditing provide that guarantor of success and probity that it has done in the past? So to get into those questions, to explore some of those themes, I'm delighted to be joined by a truly fantastic panel of speakers who I'm incredibly grateful for giving up their precious time to be with us today. Our first speaker is going to be the UK's net zero business champion, Andrew Griffith MP. He'll be known to many of you, but before becoming an MP for Arundel and South Downs in 2019 and taking up his current role, Andrew was the Prime Minister's Chief Business Advisor in Number 10, and before that, a leading businessman for many years, especially as Group Chief Operating Officer at Sky, serving on the board of directors there for 11 years and serving 11 million UK households in the process. And he was previously at PwC and Rothschilds before that. Our second speaker will be Professor Vanessa Knapp, OBE. She is a visiting professor at the Department of Law at Queen Mary University and an honorary professor at Brunel University London as well. She has in the past been a partner at Freshfields and is the UK representative on the Company Law Committee of the Council of Bars and Law Societies of Europe as well. Then we will come to Janet Williamson. Janet is a senior policy officer at the TUC, Trade Union Congress, and leads the TUC's work on corporate governance and capital markets in particular. She's a member of the Financial Reporting Council's Stakeholder Advisory Committee and the Corporate Governance Committee of the ICAEW, amongst many others, and was also the founder and chair of Trade Union Share Owners, which is a group of trade union investors who collaborate on voting at company AGMs in line with trade union values. Then we will come to John Penrose MP. John is the Prime Minister's anti-corruption champion. He has an illustrious career in Parliament campaigning for reforms to capitalism and to markets, not least in his 2018 paper, A Shining City Upon a Hill, which called for a number of reforms, including a UK sovereign wealth fund and reforming utilities to put users in the driving seat. Before entering Parliament, John was also a successful businessman and has been a whip, tourism minister, constitution minister, and Northern Ireland minister before this role. And finally, but last but not least, we will come to Howell Ball. Howell is the UK chair and UK&I managing partner of EY. He has over 35 years of experience at the firm and has been a partner for 25 years, including as UK&I managing partner of assurance and UK head of audit. He was also a lead member on the Auditors Advisory Group for Donald Brydon's independent review into the quality and effectiveness of the UK audit market, and sits on the advisory board for the Financial Reporting Council's work in this space as well. So an extraordinarily capable and experienced panel to discuss these issues today. The way this will work is very simple and should be quite familiar to many of you. I'm going to ask each of the speakers to say 5 minutes of remarks to kind of kick off the discussion and frame the debate before I open up to questions from the floor, from you, the audience. If you do have a question, please just press the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, put in your question, and I will pose it back to the panel after opening remarks. And do so early, because all of our speakers have incredibly busy diaries and we will be finishing promptly at 5:30. We only have an hour for today's discussion. So in light of that, and without further ado, I am delighted to hand over to our first speaker, Andrew. Andrew, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And look, at the illustrious panel you've assembled, I feel very humble. I was a practicing finance director for 12 years, but never had I understood the level of depth and theory that goes on in this space. I'll confine myself to a few opening remarks, if I may, and they're sort of personal observations as much as anything else, if you like. It is clear that the global pandemic has changed many perceptions on many fronts. And indeed, it would be more surprising than not, would it not, if it didn't also reframe somewhat of the perception of businesses. So, we've seen businesses and indeed parts of civil society and parts of the public sector that perhaps we took for granted. We didn't understand their vital role in society. One looks at supply chains. We've all become supply chain experts in those difficult first few months of the pandemic. And once learned, we're not going to unlearn that. I think, as ever, business will, when the scores are sort of fully in, business will have as you would expect, a sort of mixed picture. But by and large, they've reminded us how they put food on the table, how they create vaccines, how they're able to procure, enormously complex pieces of equipment that have deep and extended supply chains in a very quick and rapid and commercial time. So what I call the ferocious problem-solving power of business, of capital, and working with government. I don't think we should accept any definition of monopoles here. I think will broadly seem to have been tested and tested well. And as enterprises, remember, businesses are enterprises. They're the confluence of labor and capital and ideas. They also are remarkably resilient. We've seen the resilience through the 2008 financial crisis, which had one dimension. People look at the pandemic and liken it more often, though it's without the first-hand knowledge of any of your speakers, to be clear, but people liken it to the Second World War. I actually think, from my observation, it will be more profound than that. This has involved every domain simultaneously. The schools, how we educate our children, how government works, how business itself works, and how capital markets work. And it is remarkable, really, when we think about the scale of what's been gone through, that no real part of that has burst the rivets, as it were. The second point I would make is I also think this has, and I have very first-hand observation of this has changed the way business interact with government. But both sides of that, and we were through a particularly terse period that I sat on both sides of the fence in first as a businessman and secondly in number 10. It's been a particularly difficult period for the last, X number of years, really since 2016, but I would argue the antecedents of that itself go back to 2008 and the financial crisis and the bank bailout. The two trajectories of government and politics and business have been on a divergent path. And I actually think that, I'm sure the pandemic has brought those two back much more into alignment. You've seen, I sat in on meetings where cabinet ministers had their sleeves rolled up, working the phones with CEOs, not intermediated by, business federations, but direct and transactional. Can you help get, this supply of toilet rolls? What do we need to do in the supermarkets? How do we unblock the ports? That, to my mind, is absolutely positive. And it's a little bit more muscular in terms of from government, and it's been a bit direct, and policy making has probably been stronger as a result of that. So we shouldn't do a full debrief, lessons learned, all the rest of it here today in the interests of time. But I absolutely think that those connections between government ministers and business, again, are not going to be unlearned. And there's some positives definitely there for policy making and indeed for corporate governance. I want finally just to try and talk about, to bring the debate we're going to have to light through my particular lens, which is net zero. So my day job is talking and working with businesses of every size, from the biggest FTSE 100, I think that's technically Unilever at the moment, to the 6 millionth small business, sole trader, working from their home and their van, and encouraging those businesses to take action on climate, which I think many people would argue is the biggest crisis that we face and one that's existential in terms of our whole planet. And I would advocate that this is a case study for volunteerism. We'll talk about governance, we'll talk about the efficacy of changing the legal framework, and I'm not entirely against that. But I took on this role in November. When I did, about 10 FTSE 100 companies had made a pledge, a science-based 1.5 degree compatible pledge to net zero, in the miasma of pledges and the government providing significant leadership. As of today, we are well through 40. So by voluntary endeavor alone, by picking up the phone and asking and explaining the context and why it is important, from my role, probably on behalf of the government, people would say, I'm a champion, I'm not a minister, but also with investors putting a similar pressure, employees absolutely doing the same, and customers. So that sort of sense of multiple different stakeholders all employing their voice and no more than their voice, or their ability to take their labour somewhere else or take their customs somewhere else, has generated what I think is one of the largest increases in a particular area in the shortest period of time. When I look at what happened to issues like say on pay or diversity on boards, they took much longer than we've achieved, I think, over the last 6 months alone. So I guess I have a slight point of view that there's an awful lot you can do through volunteerism. And I'll leave my remarks there, Will, to give space to colleagues.
Andrew, fantastic. Thank you. That sets us up remarkably well, and not least because it has kind of exemplified some of this debate in a specific policy area. And I'm very interested to get into net zero and the implications on this debate in future. So I will now come to our second speaker. So Professor Vanessa Knapp, over to you.
Thanks very much, Will, and hello, everyone. I suppose I agree with Andrew that what the pandemic has done is really shone a spotlight onto some things that probably we did know existed already, but it's really highlighted both the inequalities in society, and also the importance of thinking about sustainability in the long term and not just thinking about the short term, although you can't have one without the other. And I think it's shown that it's really important that businesses provide information to the public at large so people know how businesses do affect society and what they're doing. And the good news is that we already have quite a lot that's helping companies to do that. So, for example, under the Corporate Governance Code, we already have a principle that the board of directors should be clear about what the company's purpose is and what its values and strategy is, and make sure that its culture is helping it achieve that, and also encouraging it to engage effectively with all the different sorts of stakeholders. And anyone who knows anything about business knows that a business can't exist without its stakeholders. And we also have requirements for companies to report at least once a year on the way that the directors take decisions and the way that they've thought about those stakeholder interests when they've been taking decisions over the last year. And the Financial Reporting Council has already been working quite hard to help improve companies' practice in that sort of area. And also, I think there's been a real change in the way that shareholders and investors, the people who invest our pension monies for us and look after our interests, the way that they engage with companies. And I think there are some really encouraging signs there. But I think when I think about Will's second question, which is how do you define good corporate behaviour in modern Britain, that's a really tricky one because I think it's very difficult to do. And that's partly because business varies so much. So as Andrew said, you've got really large companies like Unilever, you've got people who are sole traders, and you know, any regulation or law you come up with has to deal with those extremes of size. There's complexity in the sort of business you've got. Are you international across all the world? Are you just in the UK? What sort of stakeholders have you got? Where are they? How do you engage with them? And I think thinking about what we might do in the future, one of the really important things is to think about keeping the UK as a really attractive place for people to set up a company and run a business, and for people to want to be the directors of those businesses. At the moment, the government is consulting on changes that they may bring in as the Financial Reporting Council transitions to become ARGA. ARGA is likely to be a very powerful regulator, and I think there's going to be some overlap between it and the Financial Conduct Authority, which regulates listed companies whose shares are traded on the stock exchange. And it's really important, if we're going to have two regulators who are operating in a similar sort of space, that they cooperate really well together, and also looking at it from the point of view of the companies and the directors, that we think about the checks and balances that we need. And a lot of the detail, it's too early to say how that's going to work. So it'll be really important that the regulator does consult before it does anything. And if it's going to bring in more detailed standards as to what is good behaviour for a certain sort of company, that it consults on that before we get into it. I think also it would be good if we had a phased approach. So start with the big companies, see whether the proposals are working well for the bigger companies, and then see if we do need to extend them to some of the smaller companies. And we are already, I'm very much with Andrew, I think volunteerism is a fantastic approach. We're already seeing, for example, in the area of directors' remuneration, that companies themselves are starting to think about remunerating their directors on the basis of not just financial KPIs, but non-financial KPIs, and investors getting much more engaged in those sorts of discussions. I just wanted to say a little bit about the role of auditors, although with Hal here, I'm sure he can do a much better job than I can on that. My point is that I worry about people who think that auditors can be a guarantee of future success. Because I really don't think that auditors can be a guarantee of future success. And I think if you think that's what they're there to do, you will almost inevitably be disappointed, at least on some occasions. A lot of work has been done already to increase the amount of professional skepticism that auditors bring to the work that they do. And the standards to do with things like thinking about fraud in businesses are being tightened all the time. And yes, of course, auditors can spot problems and can do something to alert the company and shareholders to those problems. And I think we are moving to a situation where at least the very large companies may go outside to audit firms to ask for more assurance on some of the things. But I think it's important to remember that it's the directors who run businesses who know the businesses best and have to make that difficult balancing act of thinking about what is the company trying to do, who's affected by this, how do we balance these competing interests, and also the shareholders who are the ones who are responsible for engaging with the company and when they've got concerns raising them. And the final thing I wanted to say, which you might think is quite strange for someone who spent all her life being a corporate lawyer, is that on the whole, I don't think law is a good way to change people's behaviour. I think there are many other much better ways of doing it. So don't think that just by introducing a law you will solve a problem. In my experience, it doesn't quite work like that.
Vanessa, thank you very much. And there are already quite a lot of themes which I'm really looking forward to getting into in the Q&A, and lots of crossover, I think, both kind of spiritually and in substance between what you and Andrew said, especially on volunteerism, but also on kind of culture rather than necessarily regulation. If I could now come to our third speaker of the panel, Janet.
Yes, thanks very much, Will, and it's a pleasure to be here to discuss this, important topic today. Well, I'd agree with the previous speakers that the pandemic has shone a new light on the relationship between business society and, in particular, the world of work in the private sector, which is what I'm going to focus on in my remarks. And one element of this is our reliance during the pandemic on workers in supermarkets, delivery drivers, transport workers, and so on. And many of us, I think, were clapping not only NHS staff in the weekly claps, but also these private sector workers who kept us all fed and provided for during lockdown. Many of these jobs, though, are not only low paid, but also insecure. And before the pandemic, insecure work in the UK had risen sharply to reach 3.6 million, or 1 in 9 working people. This includes people on 0 or short hours contracts, those employed through third parties, whether that's agencies, umbrella companies, or using a franchise model, and those forced into low paid self-employment. So average wages were still lower before the pandemic than they were in 2008, before the financial crisis. We hadn't regained what working people lost in that big reset of the financial crisis. I think the pandemic has exposed the vulnerability of many in the labour market, and also, the deadly consequences in the context of the pandemic. And it also created some new inequalities as well. So mortality rates in the sectors characterised by insecure work have been higher than those with more secure jobs. Insecure workers are nearly 10 times more likely to say that they receive no sick pay compared to secure workers. And the government's test and trace agency has made it very clear that lack of adequate sick pay has hampered its ability to identify and isolate COVID cases and their contacts, because people simply cannot afford to isolate. And better paid workers were more likely to be able to work from home. So I wish I could agree that the pandemic has reframed the relationship between business and society. I certainly hope that there is still the opportunity for this, but to date, in many cases, it's made it worse. You will have heard about fire and rehire practices from the media, but it's hard to get a sense of scale and proportion from those reports. Worryingly, polling research has revealed that nearly 1 in 10 workers have been told to reapply for their jobs on worse terms and conditions or face the sack. And almost a quarter of workers say that their working terms, such as pay or hours, have been downgraded since the first lockdown in March last year. So after the financial crisis, we saw a deterioration in terms of conditions and the rise of things like 0 hours contracts, all of which contributed to the fact that before the pandemic, average real wages were still below pre-financial crisis levels, as I mentioned already. So this driving down of terms and conditions risks resetting the relationship between business and workers in the wrong direction. A positive development has been the role of unions in the crisis. Unions have worked absolutely tirelessly to ensure workers had PPE at the start of the crisis and, a safe working environment throughout. Unions were at the forefront of lobbying for the furlough scheme, which has, played a vital role preserving jobs and helping businesses to stay afloat, and have worked constructively with the government throughout the crisis on a whole range of initiatives, including the return to work. Union membership rose during the pandemic, despite a sharp contraction in the numbers of those in employment, as workers have basically voted with their feet and sought the protection of joining a union and the collective organisation and voice that brings. And as an aside, as this is about business, but I will just say in response to the government's recent announcement on the certification officer, that after that constructive working relationship between unions and government during the pandemic, it is disappointing to see government opting to tie unions up in red tape rather than address the problems working people are facing. Talk very briefly about good corporate behaviour in relation to employment, and then briefly again about the current BEIS consultation. What does good look like? I'm running out of time, so I'll reduce this just to sort of 2 key points. Fundamentally, companies should move away from business models that are based on precarious employment. Outsourcing the employment of those responsible for the company's products or services doesn't reduce the company's responsibility for their treatment, but it does significantly reduce its control over how they are treated. So companies should move away from that and employ the workers directly on secure contracts. And secondly, companies must take workforce voice seriously and allow their workforce to come together to speak with one voice in engaging on strategic issues and where they wish it for the purposes of collective bargaining as well. So finally, to corporate governance. One welcome development has been, I think Vanessa's already mentioned this, but the 2018 revision of the Corporate Governance Code, which puts much greater emphasis on stakeholder interests and voice than previous versions. I think although the impact on practice may take time, it does put stakeholder relationships firmly at the centre of corporate governance. So it's not possible for a company with poor stakeholder or workforce relationships to lay claim to good corporate governance. I think that's a very welcome development. I'll make one point, as I think I am out of time really, in relation to the BEIS consultation. It will require the opening up of primary legislation in relation to company law for the first time since 2006. And although I do agree that volunteerism has a vital role to play in terms of changing corporate practice and indeed all other types of behaviour, that doesn't all happen in a vacuum. And I think the regulatory system has a vital role to play in encouraging and incentivising positive behaviour and discouraging negative. So we'll be making one very, we'll be making a range of proposals, but I want to just highlight one very specific but important proposal. And that is that the word employee should be replaced by workforce throughout the Companies Act. This would have the effect of broadening the scope of the reporting requirements in the Companies Act to require companies to report on their whole workforce rather than just their directly employed employees as at present. And I'd really describe this as, closing a loophole, because when the Companies Act was being drafted prior to 2006, indirect employment was far, far less prevalent than now. And the word employee was clearly not intended to differentiate between different parts of a company's workforce. It was just meant in a much more generic way. But unfortunately, the use of the word employee, it does have a legal meaning, and it does have a direct impact on the quality and accuracy of company reporting. And some companies that do actually employ a significant proportion of their workforce indirectly or through a franchising model simply exclude those workers from the scope of their company reports, despite the latter's contribution to the company's products or services and therefore productivity. And that is a change, the changing of the word employee to workforce, which has already been made throughout other parts of corporate governance. So the 2018 Corporate Governance Code and indeed the Wales Corporate Governance Principles for large private companies both use the word workforce throughout. So I'm hoping that a wide range of organisations, whatever other perspectives they may have on corporate governance, will join us in making this, quite small, but I think quite significant point. And if anyone here would like any further information on that, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. I'll put my email in the chat. So thanks very much.
Janet, thank you very much, and really, really valuable to have the TUC perspective, and particularly to bring in relationship between labour and capital and the dynamics therein, and to have some practical proposals as well. So thank you very much. If I could now come to John Penrose MP. John.
Thank you, Will. And can I perhaps start where Janet left off, talking about the question of legitimacy and legitimacy of our capitalist free market system and the way we all play a part in that. And also echoing what Professor Knapp said about the fact that laws only are a tiny fraction about changing behaviour. They have a role to play clearly, but they're only a tiny piece of the overall thing that we need to achieve here. And what do I mean by legitimacy? Well, every once in a while, capitalism needs an update. And society moves on, technology moves on, and so must our free market capitalist system as well. And I think ever since the 2008 banking crash, but now, as I think both Andrew and Janet and Professor Knapp were all making the point, particularly during the pandemic, what's been revealed is that some of the changes that began or were revealed in the 2008 banking crash have been really brought into sharp focus by the pandemic. And the fact that the outcomes for people who have nice white-collar jobs and can work from home and basically have managed to carry on working quite happily and have not been exposed to high risks of infection have been dramatically different from essential workers who have had to carry on going out to work in much less well-paid employment, often insecure employment, as Janet rightly pointed out. And there's been a sort of sharp divergence of outcomes and impact of the pandemic as a result of that. And it really has been a sort of a tale of two cities, or a sort of a two-nation set of outcomes. And we need to deal with that. But what do we need to do to try and change this point about legitimacy? Well, the first thing, and I think this goes back to Andrew's opening remarks, is that we need to, all of us, get right behind the notion that business is fundamentally something which improves all our lives. The products that it produces, the services it provides, makes all our lives better, more rich, more diverse, more interesting, and provides essential services and everything from food to electricity on through as well. So it's important for us all just to stop and restate the notion that business is fundamentally a good thing if it's done in the right way. And we shouldn't have any truck with the notion that it's fundamentally a bad thing that needs to mitigate its sins by giving donations to charity or whatever it is. No, if we accept the basic principle that profit is a bad thing and that it needs to be mitigated, then we're fundamentally starting this whole debate from a very, very wrong place. But nonetheless, it needs to be done in the right way. The whole system needs to be set up so it is set up for the benefits of consumers, and for all of us as workers as well. And what does that mean? Well, there are a number of things it needs to do. The first one is, I think we need to be really clear that government and regulators need to be absolutely fierce about identifying and then stopping consumer rip-offs. The moment you feel that the system is stacked against you as a consumer, that you are powerless in the face of your energy company, your water company, your technology, your online digital service provider, whatever it may be. The moment you feel powerless in the face of them and you know that you're not getting good value, but you can't do anything about it, that's when you start to say, well, actually, the whole system is stacked against the man or the woman in the street, and it's slanted in favor of big business, of bosses, of bureaucrats, of politicians, of investors, rather than people who have to work for a living. So we need to be really fierce in defense of consumers and make sure the system is set up in favor of them. That means everything from utilities regulators through to the costs of housing. Why has successive governments failed to build enough housing for about 40 years? And as a result, we have rather predictably an excess of demand over supply and skyrocketing prices, whether it is to rent or to buy. So there's a series of measures, some which the government's already doing, things like housing reform, planning reform, absolutely essential to try and free up the supply of housing, but others which it needs to start doing more of when it comes to things like regulating utilities in order to make sure that we are set up fiercely on the side of consumers. Happy to talk in more detail, Will, if people want to about that. Secondly, legitimacy goes wider than that. London in particular, but Britain overall, has in the past been too much a safe haven for dirty money. for kleptocrats, for oligarchs, for people who have earned their money by siphoning it out of the hard work of people in less developed nations and investing it in the UK. That is clearly undermining the basic principles of if you work hard and do the right thing, you will do well. That's fine. But if you can see the person down the road is swanning around driving a Ferrari when they haven't done the right thing, they haven't worked hard for a living, and they have basically done all the wrong things, then we need to, justice needs to be seen to be done in order to make sure that people can still see that doing the right thing and hard work pays off. I think we're starting to take, again, important steps in the right direction. Some of the improvements in our sanctioning regime, for example, have been vital in that respect, but we need to go a great deal further. Some of the things we're doing for corporate transparency, revealing beneficial ownerships and who really owns the shares and has the controlling interests in our companies, also absolutely vital. But again, we can go a great deal further there. And equally, we need to have trust in in what we read online, trust in what we see and hear. And so therefore, digital regulation in the newly digitizing market is absolutely essential. And that means, for example, that we need to have a system which predictably tells us when something we read online is factually accurate or just something that has been spread either by deliberate misinformation or made up by a mate down the pub. Either way, we need to have some way of telling, is this true, is it not? And the difficulty in spotting factually inaccurate statements, particularly in the online world nowadays, is a great deal harder than it is in the more familiar and traditional offline and analog world. That has to change in order to make sure that I can trust you when you say something, you can trust me when I say something, and if we say something that's palpably untrue, it's really easily, clearly visible. Ditto, incidentally, we need to have something which allows us to for us to get balance in our own personal filter bubble. So when we see something that's coming in from outside, the online filter bubble that vets what we see needs to be much more balanced than it is at the moment. I will stop there, Will, other than to say that the final point I pick up on is Janet's point about security of employment. And there, the Taylor Review is something which ministers have accepted pretty much all the recommendations in it. We've had the pandemic. Now is the time to get on as we come up for air after the pandemic for implementing what they've already accepted. And that, I think, will be a huge step in the right direction for dealing with workers' rights and making sure that the concerns about that will all, I hope, be dissolved away over time.
John, thank you very much. And this is such a rich conversation. We're touching on so many different themes, which all of which are kind of held within this question of the relationship between business and society. So thank you. That's fantastic. Hal, last but not least, it'd be fantastic to hear from you as to your views of this crucial issue.
Yeah, thank you, Will, and hello, everyone. Look, I suppose it'd be remiss if I don't start with a few words on audit. Then I would like to talk about the social contract with business and give some examples of what we're doing to bring it to life. As auditors, actually, in a funny way, with our public interest duty, we've got a stated societal contract that we're very focused on. And we're also very pleased that the government is taking a holistic approach to audit reform, with both the regulator, the auditor, and corporates. I do see a strong analogy here with a three-legged stool. We can't just fix one or two of the legs. And as Vanessa mentioned quite strongly, the role of directors is key in that. I do also agree in voluntary action. We are close now to voluntary agreeing our operational separation principles and doing that in advance of any legislation as part of our commitment to that public interest. And it is important that we get the speed of change right and we get the sequencing right and the balance right, but we need a strong corporate reporting and audit ecosystem to maintain UK capital markets and maintain their attractiveness. Our own recent UK attractiveness survey had investors looking at the answer about whether they would invest in the UK over the next 12 months was a fantastic 41%. This has been the strongest we've ever experienced, up from 23% in 19 and 31% in 20. And I think it's vital that we maintain that, and having that strong audit and corporate reporting ecosystem is vital. On the broader social contract for business, I think it's a hugely topical subject. I spoke last week on the launch of what was called the purpose tapes at the Bank of England. with the Purposeful Company Group. And this concept or this challenge about stakeholder versus shareholder was a key investor challenge at the day. And as John mentioned, I think this refresh of the capital markets, I think everyone sort of realized that since Friedman's paper, late 60s, on shareholder primacy, you've slowly seen the momentum swing now, the pivot to a more stakeholder view. And it was a big discussion on that panel. But fundamentally, I believe that creating long-term value for all the stakeholders ultimately delivers the best long-term sustainable shareholder value. And I think most companies now accept that purpose is the accelerator and the catalyst for that. And again, as Andrew eloquently started with, this post-pandemic have changed our focus on that and really got us thinking about this. So if I think about how we reacted, at the start of the pandemic, our own purpose is building a better working world. And there was no pandemic playbook for the businesses as there wasn't for many people at the start. But we used our own purpose to guide our way. As Janet mentioned, security of job was so important to our people. So at the very start, we made a public commitment of no job losses for as long as we possibly could. And we kept that going all the way through the meat of the pandemic. We decided to honor all our graduate recruitment. We recruit 1,000 graduates a year. We knew that was the group that was going to be most exposed. And indeed, we honored all the A-level offers to our school leavers that would join us, because we recognized that they were having a horrendous time with the A-level sort of changes that were going on. And we also thought we didn't want to take any government or furlough unless we absolutely had to, and we didn't. Now, as we sort of come out of the pandemic, we're also thinking of the big issues that have already been talked about today: climate, racial justice, regional employment. I know all eyes are on COP26, as I'd already mentioned, for climate, but I also think the Green Investment Summit the government is planning is very exciting. I think that'd be an amazing platform for us to look at green jobs. We've made our own public commitment that we'll be net zero and science-based targets by 2025, and a much more aggressive target than many companies are able to do, but that's probably the nature of our business. And if I think about other areas that are important for the social contract, racial justice, certainly when we experienced the murder of George Floyd and we started talking more to our people about it, I was really shocked by the feelings and the cry for action. And that led to us publishing 7 anti-racist comments. And in fact, later this week, we'll launch a survey with the CBI on the potential for young Blacks in the workforce, and a call for action for all businesses to help them do that. Just to finally pick up Andrew's point about thinking about this interaction between government and business on the key areas that the country faces, I think that's where you truly bring your purpose to life. So we're thinking and acting and behaving where we believe we can add value on the big topical issues where we believe we sit in that junction on climate, trade, technology, and as John mentioned, I think trust is really important and sits with us quite strongly. Just to finish, I'm a hugely strong believer in what we call the long-term value framework, which is about ultimately being very careful and considerate about how you're delivering value for all your stakeholders and be catalyzed by your purpose. And I think now it's never more so necessary than post the pandemic. Thank you, Will.
Hal, thank you so much, and thank you to all of those contributions. That was, as I said earlier, kind of an incredibly rich introduction to the discussion. We've got about 15 minutes left for Q&A, which I'm delighted about because there have been questions streaming in, which I will come to. But before I come to those, I want to dig in a little bit to this question of volunteerism versus regulation, because it seems to me to sit at the heart of this debate, and the extent to which government will want or needs to act itself through regulation and legislation in the coming years. Because when I think back on, I mean, you mentioned net zero, Andrew, we've had the national living wage and kind of action from government to push employers to pay more in the last decade or so. Both of those are instances where there has been volunteerism, but there's also been and government regulation has helped, but government regulation has come off the back of activity from business itself, and often actually being used to effectively confirm something that was already happening within the business community. And Howell, you may well argue that the same thing is true of the corporate governance reforms that we're seeing today. I just wonder, to what extent do our panel and I might come to a few of you in particular, feel like this is actually businesses' problem to define, or kind of a solution to define, problem to fix, or whether or not it is something that voters and indeed industry leaders may plant at the feet of Parliament and government. Is this something that we should be asking business themselves to primarily come up with an answer to, or is it something that the Parliament ultimately will be the arbitrator and decider of? If I can perhaps start with Howell, actually, if I may, just because I'm very interested in your views, given the current state of the corporate governance reforms, and then I might try and bring in Vanessa in particular, given your kind of legal background, before I come to Q&A. And if anyone else would like to come in on this question, feel free to just raise your hand and I'll bring you in. Hal?
I think it does start with, Vanessa mentioned this is about companies being explicit around their purpose and stakeholder value creation, because that fundamentally drives the voluntary activity that you're going to do. Because if you're very clear about how you're trying to create that stakeholder value, whether that's societal or for your people, you will put into place actions that drive that. And ultimately then, if government sees that they're systemically important and actually this is a good thing, then they've got a very good base to apply a legislation to. I always worry when legislation comes in advance of any free market innovation and activity. So the much better sort of cycle is for businesses to deliver, the good businesses to show the way and to drive that innovation, and then deliver the platform that would allow government to spread that good activity across the bad businesses through some form of legislation. So I'm a great believer in that, and I think it's driving those companies to disclose how they're very clearly and articulate how they're creating stakeholder value.
Thank you, Hal. Vanessa, could I bring you in, and then I know Janet would like to come in too after that.
Yes, I think businesses can't exist other than in the real world, and their very success depends on the people who work for them, their customers, and we've seen that it only takes one disaffected person in an organization to make public something that they're very unhappy about, and that can have a tremendous impact on a business. So whether companies like it or not, they have to think about all of these things if they want to be successful. And so actually, I think this is something that doesn't get talked about very much, but I think increasingly we don't need to rely on law, because there is so much power just through the public at large in putting pressure onto businesses and getting them to change things. The good businesses see that getting this balance right is actually what makes them successful. And they want to explain to people how they are taking all these different things into account and how that's making them more successful both now and for the longer term too. And I think the trick, which we've managed to do really well in this country over many years, through our sort of comply and explain approach to corporate governance, is detecting where these trends are going, getting them into our corporate governance code, which we can do relatively quickly, much quicker than if we use legislation. And the great benefit of the corporate governance code is that you can update it every 2 years. You can see where things are going, you can encourage things. And the FRC has been really good by doing reports on what's good practice, identifying practice which is not so good, and trying to help people see the sorts of things they should be thinking about and doing. I tend to think of legislation as being a sort of, your thing of last resort, where you really want to be able to say to somebody, your behaviour is really reprehensible, and so there should be, some nasty sanction for getting things wrong. But it's not a good way to encourage people to good behaviour, I don't think.
Vanessa, thank you. Janet, can I bring you in? And then I'm going to do one round of questions from the audience, particularly with reference to Andrew, who I know may need to leave a little bit early, and John as well. So Janet first.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to be very quick, because I very largely agree with the points that have been made. But I do agree that voluntary initiatives or just pure innovation, if you like, is very frequently the best way of finding the best models or relationships, or whatever the issue is at hand. But I would like to say that I don't think that we should see the volunteerism and the law as in opposition. I think we do need both. And, we do have very good corporate practice on the one hand, and, sadly, a long tail of poor practice. And I think some of the statistics I quoted, 1 in 9 of the workforce in insecure work, that's a failure. It's a failure of corporate governance and employment practice. And so you do need minimum standards on the one hand, but there will always be a really important role for voluntary progress way above those minimum standards on the other. I agree that minimum standards should not define what's good. That's the legal minimum. And then, the role for businesses and all parts of society is, generally to strive to go significantly above that.
Thank you, Janet. So I'm now going to bring in some questions from the audience, and there's lots of recurring themes in these questions. So I'm going to try and bring them together into one single question, which I will pose to Andrew, to John, and then to anyone else who would like to come in. Which is, if we are going to legislate or regulate in this space, how is the best way of doing that? So we reward ethical companies who balance profit with national and individual need and discourage unethical behaviour. That's a question from Samuel Davies. But I'm going to add to it a number of the suggestions which have come in other questions. So one suggestion is company workers on board. We've obviously had a debate about that in the last couple of years in this country. Another suggestion is rewriting directors' duties, specifically to embed stakeholder interests into that. And then another suggestion is specifically looking at the Taylor reforms and particularly perhaps linking what Matthew Taylor said with kind of wider corporate governance and the kind of the governance of companies particularly. So I guess the question is therefore, what is the method? If we are going to legislate or regulate, what is the method of driving better corporate governance standards? If I could come to Andrew first, then I'll come to John, and then I'll come to others on the panel. Andrew.
Thank you, Will. Well, I will answer the question. There's no question I won't answer. But I do want to just go back to both what Hal and Vanessa said. I mean, this point about core purpose, and I saw this close hand. There's a propensity to sort of for companies to talk a great deal, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, about the local school whose sports day or whose trees they are planting. Right. But if you are the nation's broadband provider, your core purpose to me is connectivity and unleashing the, human enterprise and the social equality and the leveling up from that. Right. If you're a medical supplies provider or a vaccine provider, it's not these, ancillary, whilst they are highly worthwhile and to be valued, they're not those ancillary things. And I think, that's just a really, really good and important framing for what we talk about. The second on legislation is the bar is high, right? And the bar is high. It's not because of some, predilection not to legislate, but because we all know it is extraordinarily slow, right? It's a terrible, terrible instrument. I do think there is a role for legislation, but it's slow. The propensity of government to consult at each and every stage means that these become elongated. And the point at which legislation appears, one could have gone much further and faster and solved the challenge in other ways. So I will answer the question about how you would do it, but I think that's a really, really important caveat. The question was, how do you reward good behaviour? I mean, again, I'm not wedded to volunteerism, but there are loads of ways of doing it. Right. So I would give you an example of the Royal Warrant scheme. Right. The warrant is voluntary. It is highly respected. It has its own, private law, if you like, accreditation. But as a result, it's dynamic and it's it's law from your peers. And that's about the extent of my knowledge on that particular scheme. But there are lots of those. There are lots of kite marks. I've been advocating to business that the kite mark they should be looking for on climate is the race to zero. Another example of private international law, if you like, that is UN accredited. It's based on some private advisory groups that draw on expert best practice. You can lose it, so you can be sanctioned. And then the UK government has got behind something that the United Nations has already incepted. So there are lots of examples like this. I'm sure Janet's got lots of examples from the labour and union world of where we understand what good looks like. The best role for law, I would advocate intellectually, is sort of what I'd call the sweeper at the back of the peloton. You know, there are industries that by their nature are fragmented. And however well the best movers move, and they can bring up the whole average, there may still be an incentive at the tail that Janet talked about to cut corners, not to use best practice, to engage in, you know, we've got to be careful, but what some would regard as unfair competition. And that feels like a reasonable role for law and regulation, but against the presumption that we've talked about. My concern, I've engaged in the debate on directors' duties, again from climate, right? And climate's probably the high watermark of that debate. There's a broad consensus. You know, it's across all political parties, and it's a clear and present danger. That said, it seems to me one of the questions I would love to have answered about reforming directors' duties is how one avoids the jeopardy of entering a lawyer's charter. So we have settled case law around directors' duties for good or bad. And actually it's been relatively elastic, and it has moved on in recent years as we've seen judicial activism. The danger with anybody starting ab initio and writing a new set of directors' duties is that however well-intentioned we are, we need 10 years of case law and precedent to actually tease out how courts will interpret those. And I engage in this debate actively as a practitioner and someone, you know, interested in how we can improve this space. And I've yet to have a really good answer as to how we don't end up in that world.
Andrew, thank you. I fear we may not have enough time for Vanessa or indeed others to give you a detailed answer, but we should return to that question because I think it's a vital question and very well made point. John, if I could come to you, and I'm sorry, but we are very rapidly running out of time, so I don't know if we are going to be able to come to other panel members. But John, if you would like to say a few words before we close.
Thank you. I'll keep this short. Just to say that Andrew is absolutely right about the cumbersome and clunky nature of rulemaking and legislation. And the problem with it is that if you start legislating for process, and that includes, incidentally, corporate governance, then pretty soon you come up with something which has taken you years to create and is almost certainly out of date by the time you get to pass it, and certainly will be out of date 10 years after you've passed it as well. So I think that there is a place for legislation where you have an inequality of power, an imbalance of power. That's why it's important that where you, for example, need to do something to implement the Taylor report, that you do that when it comes to changing workers' rights and changing the imbalance of power where you have people who have insecure employment and don't have many other options. But if you start to legislate, the equivalent of creating a written constitution, if you start to legislate for how things are done, you pretty soon end up going ever into more and more detail about process. And there's no guarantee that it's actually going to solve the issues that you need to solve. So I'm sort of with Vanessa on this. If you stick with what we've currently got, all the case law that Andrew was talking about, then ultimately it's up to directors to take into account the ever-shifting set of society's expectations, societal norms. It may be climate today and it's vitally important, but it'll be something different and equally important in 20 years' time. And ultimately, directors have to navigate those shifting sands and moving shoals. And if you give them the duty of doing so successfully and making a surplus at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if it's a profit or if you're a not-for-profit, a surplus which they can then reinvest in your central core purpose. If you do it well, then that's just a way of keeping score. It's just a way of saying you've done it well and you've managed to do it in a way that's more efficient than one of your competitors. I don't see any fundamental need to change that. providing you have the vibrant civic society and social pressures, which we've all been talking about, which means that people get pilloried if they don't do it right, and providing you make a absolute legal requirement where you have those inequalities of power in the first place. I'll stop there given tightness of time, but it is absolutely a core piece that if you try and legislate for everything, you will get nowhere and you'll be out of date really quick.
Fantastic, thank you, John. And that's a brilliant note to end on, partly because it, I think, captures one of the key insights from this discussion, which is that actually there are limits to regulation and law in terms of trying to drive some of the outcomes that we're clearly all trying to strive towards here, which is better corporate governance, protection of stakeholder interests, and the kind of maintenance of ethical behaviour amongst firms on their own behalf as much as on behalf of their consumers and workers and other stakeholders and wider society. I've been really struck that actually there's been a huge amount of agreement from lots of different perspectives on this panel. You have all agreed that there is a very clear likelihood and need in lots of ways to think quite seriously about the relationship between business and society coming out of the pandemic. But also, I think there is a recognition from all of you that will happen actually to a large degree through businesses themselves, through a changing corporate culture and various things that are already happening around environment, workers' rights and others. There may well be a role for government in setting some of those rules and boundaries, and we should definitely not rule that out in any respect. But we should also expect quite a high bar from business itself and from directors themselves in setting that purpose and holding companies to a high standard. And we can expect quite a high degree of pressure from consumer and investor groups in driving some of that behaviour as well. So I think this has been a really optimistic discussion. It's been incredibly detailed despite brevity of time, and I would really love to reconvene and kind of have this conversation again, because I feel like we are literally scratching the surface of an incredibly deep and important discussion. So I've taken 3 more minutes of all of your time than I'd intended to, so I'm very grateful for you for sticking around, very grateful for Andrew for making it, and I knew already that he had to drop off very promptly at 5:30. So can I just thank you all for your contributions. Thank you in particular to EY for helping to stage this discussion and kind of support the public policy debate in this space, because it is clearly vitally important, and we're in an incredibly important time in that debate. And could I ask all of you to potentially keep in touch with Onward on this subject, and for us to think quite seriously about what more we do in the space, because I think it's not discussed enough, and there is a lot to play for in the coming months and years in this space. So thank you all, and thank you to everyone who tuned in and asked such brilliant questions. And if I could just say thank you very much from Onward, and look forward to seeing you all very soon. Thank you.